Well, good evening, everybody. I'm glad to have you on board for our December webinar for the steer profitability competition. And so I hope you all got an email. Each of you would have gotten an email from me today with a summary of your steer's tag number, what pen they're in, and their initial weight. And then this afternoon or evening, Chip Kemp is going to be our presenter this evening. He's going to talk a little bit about what happened in getting the steers processed, and then we're also going to learn more about the initial value of your steer, as well as maybe some prediction for what those steers are going to be worth at harvest through the feeder profit calculator tool, and Chip's going to talk about that. So with that, I'll mute myself and turn that over to Chip.
Thank you very much. Well, again, welcome everybody. Honored to be able to hang with you all this evening. Should you have questions or comments, just chat those in there on the side of the screen, and we'll answer those as we go through. So what we really want to do, as Rachel just mentioned, was we want to bring you up to speed on kind of where we're at. Some of that you're going to see based on the various numbers and data points that she had put into the CAP data sheet there at juniorsimmental.org. But wanted to give you just a little bit more detail on that, and then go into some detail on a fairly modern tool that some of you became a little bit exposed to last year called the IGS Feeder Profit Calculator. I'm going to explain to you a little bit what that is and how you can use it and how your understanding of that can have a much bigger impact, certainly throughout this program and this competition, but to your family's operation and folks you know at home. So with that, we're going to get cranking just a little bit. So the calves were processed actually on two different dates. We had a couple calves came in a little bit later than some of the others. And so the overwhelming majority of the calves were processed on 11/07. The remainder were processed a week later, but all received the same protocol. And so wanted to go through that protocol with you just a little bit. So one of the things it's a fairly common practice in the industry is to use a product called BovaShield Gold. BovaShield is a product that's really highly focused on a lot of various respiratory issues, things that would fall under the BRD complex. We're going to save some of the details for some of this into a little bit of a later conversation, but you can see just by the front of this picture of the box, as it were, it's a para-influenza respiratory type vaccine. So the acronyms that I have on the screen might be a good opportunity for you to spend some time a little bit later on talking to mom or dad or checking online. What is IBR and BVD? But in general, you can think of these as a complex of diseases that we refer to as BRD, bovine respiratory disorder. And that is, by some margin, the most significant concern in terms of feeder calves as they enter the feedlot. They get immunocompromised, they get a little bit weak, and so we really have to be concerned about those things. And BovaShield Gold is one of the common products, and you can see it's a Zoetis product. And so use that. All the calves received that at processing. Also, we used a product called Vision 7, and some of you may be very familiar with this product as well. It's a 7-way. It has clostridial protection. You can see it works against blackleg and pink eye. Some of you in certain parts of the country, blackleg isn't as big a concern. Some it is. And so in this part of the world, in the central part of the country, it's still a pretty significant concern. And so we want to address that. And so that's what Vision 7 does. Again, some of these are terminologies I wouldn't expect you to know. I don't expect you to be able to define all the various clostridial strains and those sort of things, but just wanted to make you aware of what products are being used. And if you want to study them a little bit further, you can. And again, some of this stuff will be discussed in a little more detail in a later webinar. Of course, we need to deworm these calves to rid them of many parasites as we can. Safeguard is a time-tested dewormer used frequently, and again, given through an oral drench. They were also implanted. Again, many of you are familiar. Here's kind of a little bit of a visual. I'm not going to say it's my favorite visual ever, because I would argue that actually most implants are given a little closer to the base of the ear. what you see in this illustration here, but it gives you some sense of what was happening there. The implants, again, as you recall, they're growth promotants. And so they help your animals function just a little bit more efficiently in terms of protein accretion and just in terms of pounds and growth going forward. This is a common practice in all commercial yards, but recognize there are certain types of cattle that will not receive an implant. For example, if you've ever heard of the term NHTC calves, these would be non-hormone treated cattle, and in that case, they would intentionally be free of any sort of implants. So you always have to do those kind of mathematical trade-offs in your head of, can I get more for a calf being maybe free of these products? Are there particular buyers who will pay me a premium for that? Versus I put these in, I get some added pounds, I sell more pounds. And so it's a trade-off. Every cattle feeder, yourselves included, have to consider these things. And as we noted at the beginning of this particular effort, most of these decisions are allowed to the expertise of the feed yard manager. And in this particular feed yard, implanting is a fairly normal procedure. They're confident that it adds to their bottom line, and in this case, to your bottom line. Then again, I think you all probably reviewed this a little bit last time, but we also made sure that we installed the visual tags. Then there's an EID, an electronic ID tag that corresponds to that visual tag. And again, at the same time, then we were able to collect some DNA through kind of a modern approach called a TSU. All of these were provided by Allflex. And so the TSU picture on the left, again, just punch a hole, grab that DNA sample. On the right is putting in an ear tag. And again, just as a reminder, I know you're probably familiar, but the purpose of that EID tag is a couple-fold. One, it is the most effective means of identification that we have that travels with the animal. EIDs rarely fall out, rarely come loose, rarely are removed. Visual tags on occasion can. So we have that EID, so we have a much better tracking mechanism in case we were to lose a tag. At the same time, from day to day, that EID is important because that's the tag, that's the manner that the GrowSafe feeding system, this automated feeding system that tracks how much your calves eat and how much they're consuming on a daily basis, it uses the EIDs to identify which calf is in there. So the EID is a better form of traceability or identification of the calf. It's utilized by the GrowSafe system. And thirdly, one of the real benefits of using the EID is when it goes through a pack implant, it's a much more secure mechanism to tie that EID back to a particular carcass. And so when you're trying to get carcass data, which is absolutely crucial to us in this particular project, that makes that a lot more of a secure process. So the EID is a valuable tool for us in your particular program. And so you can see EID sits on the top of the ear and it works with that bump. So this is where the calves are at present in terms of nutrition diet. The first number of days when they came in, they were fed a really high quality brome hay that is just to kind of get their guts right, get them a little bit on a steady course, get that rumen functioning well in those first number of days of stress as they came into the yard. Shortly thereafter, they were put on a receiving ration. And if you look at that ration and you study that ration, quite a little bit of wheat baleage and a pretty substantial amount of a receiving supplement built into that diet. And they were on that diet meant to, again, allow them to step up, as it were, to start to prepare themselves for getting a little bit of a hotter ration. And they received that receiving diet up until 11-18. Again, as we get into the depths of a nutrition conversation, some of that will be covered in a future discussion, but I wanted to expose you to some of the base components of this particular diet. That diet last year was just a smidgen cheaper. I'm guessing for a lot of you, as you live around the country, you've seen slight increases in terms of some various forages or hay or baleage, and we're no different here in the middle part of the country. And so that receiving ration went up like a tenth of maybe 1 cent now that I recall, about a penny. And then we would go down to, they've just recently started on a portion of the finishing ration. That too is a little more expensive than it was last year for the same basic reasons. And you can see the breakdown and composition of that particular diet. And they will be on this diet for quite a period of time. So, some things to note. When the calves first came in, the average live weight of those calves was right at 640. At present, or on 12/3 actually, they weighed 747, and that's where we sat yesterday in terms of the average weight for the group. So you can see we gained just a little over 100 pounds, and the average daily gain through that period of time was just a little over 4 pounds a day. A couple things I want to note as you look below those weights. We will be receiving our component of the bill here in the next day or two. That information will be passed along to you fairly directly. I wanted to give you an FYI. You're going to see some things on your bill that you'll want to know what they stand for. You'll see a miscellaneous expense, and there'll be a one-time charge on there for the grow safe. The cattle were processed, so that'll be highlighted on there. But there's also a bedding expense. So you'll see some of those things. So I just wanted to make you aware of those. When you get those bills, take a chance to study them a little bit and familiarize yourself with it so that as we go forward, if you have questions, you're comfortable asking those of us. And again, you should be seeing those bills here probably first part of next week. At the same time, the up-to-date gain information and conversion information should be updated in that CAP data sheet that Dr. Endicott mentioned. That should be updated by the early part of next week as well. So I encourage you to watch that data sheet on a fairly regular basis. It'll indicate a variety of things. Also, you should know we've had some, frankly, just pretty marginal weather in the central part of Missouri the last number of weeks. And unfortunately, as a result, we had 3 calves who got mild treatments, nothing significant. We don't have anybody who's got a serious illness, but the feed yard manager was trying to get out in front of some things. And so you'll see on those bills, if you had a calf that got treated, it will indicate the day and what the treatment was. And so just a heads up on that. Also, and you should make a note of this screen because you're going to want to come back and view this probably a little bit later when it gets posted up tomorrow, because this page has a little bit to do with your homework assignment. So if you recall from the initial information you received about the steer profitability competition, this is a little unique compared to a lot of feed out type programs because you all are fortunate enough to have cattle on a grow safe system from start to finish. We can capture essentially all of the expenses associated with your calf. And at the end, unlike a lot of these programs that have to kind of contrive or generate a way to determine winners, it's really easy for us. The value of the carcass minus your expenses is your profit, and you get ranked on that accordingly. And so one of the steps we have to do to assign expenses appropriately is to assign a value to your animal when it entered the program. And the way we do that is we use the USDA Nebraska Weekly Summary. We use Nebraska because it's sort of the hub of the beef industry right now. And so it's a very solid market that always has good reporting. And so we're always pretty consistent with that. And so we use the Nebraska Weekly Summary. And what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to go to that CAP data sheet. This is going to make sure that you know how to find it. And you're going to identify that initial weight of your calf. And then you're going to multiply that weight by the value, in this case, actually by pound value, relative to the category it falls. So, for example, if you had a calf that weighed 560 pounds, he falls in the second row right here. And that would mean you'd take 560 times 1.7511, and that's going to give the initial value of your calf for this steer profitability competition. Almost all of you are going to use the top 5 lines. But also note, we want to be as precise and as accurate in this project as we can. And so I mentioned, again, a couple calves came in a little bit later, and we want to do right by those calves and assign them the appropriate numbers. And so those calves will follow the 2 bottom lines. So again, we'll talk about that briefly a bit more as we get towards your homework assignment here just a little bit later. But this particular screen will be one that will be important to you, and you'll probably want to refer back to it when it comes time to do those calculations. With that said, we're going to shift gears just a little bit, because one of the things we want to talk about this evening is this IGS feeder profit calculator. Some of your parents, I know, have actually been in environments where we've talked about this. Some of your folks know what this tool is, and I know a couple of the families, the ranches, actually use this tool themselves. But I want to show you all the details and the behind the scenes and what it is. So with that said, you all know that sometimes some of the grown-ups in our business, you all would never do this because you're much more focused on your bottom line. But some grown-ups might leave some things just a little too much to chance. And so when we're trying to make our cattle, we're trying to hopefully build in as much profit potential as we can. And the same deal if you're a junior and this is your first time in this program, and maybe you've been showing some show heifers. Well, what are you going to do? Initially, your goal is to try to pick early on the one who has the best chance in that venue. You're trying to build in success. The same thing here when we're considering the things that are important in feeder cattle and ultimately feedlot cattle. We want to build in a high probability of success and minimize risk. So we use this tool from International Genetic Solutions, or IGS. So quickly, I don't want to belabor this part to you, but in case you've ever heard of this phrase, I just want you to know what it is or why it's called the IGS feeder profit calculator. IGS is essentially what we call the genetics side of the American Simmental Association. It's where we do the science not only for Simmental, but we do the EPDs and indexes for a whole bunch of breed associations. And you can see when you put all those together, it's easily the biggest beef evaluation on the planet. We're quickly approaching 20 million head of cattle in that database. And so that's a big deal. It gives us a lot of skill. And just so you know, that's by some margin bigger than the second largest genetic evaluation. Why is that important to you? But because it allows us then to get a really good picture of crossbreds, of composites, of various purebred cattle, and so we can really directly compare them pretty effectively. That's important then if we're going to use our skill set to identify the potential profit in your calves early on. Now, these tools aren't ever going to be 100% accurate, but the goal is, can they be distinctly more accurate? Can they be a lot more valuable than having no tool at all and just guessing? And so IGS is essentially the tech side of the ASA. You can think of it as a big data company that develops these sort of tools. Just to show you something, why this is important, why having this collaborative approach where we work with a whole bunch of different people is important. This is a particular breed that's not in the International Genetic Solutions Group. Essentially, ASA does not do the science for this particular breed of cattle. And it's a prominent breed, one that you definitely know of. And you can see when we take their primary terminal metric, or primary terminal genetic tool, that's the blue line, and their primary maternal tool, you can see how, and this is over a period of about 25 years, you can see how those two things are starting to separate from one another. What that really means is, in this particular population of cattle, they're making cattle that are very terminal. They're growing good. They have a lot of marbling. They have carcass value. But at the same time, they're becoming poorer mothers, probably more expensive mothers at the same time. These two lines are what scientists would say are diverging or going away from each other. Now, this is an approach if you stay within the IGS system. This is when you have quality balanced data in front of you, you can do things like this. And so this is actually the Simmental maternal metric and terminal metric. You would think of them maybe as API and TI, are two indexes. And you can see over that same 25 years how those two things have ran together. They are essentially going in the same basic direction. And so they are not diverging as in the previous one. They're actually running along, meaning that you're able to pick genetics that have both maternal merit and terminal merit. And so that's important as we think about how are we going to use some of our tools. Our last piece I want to show you is very specific to Simmental, And there's a lot of lines here, and so forgive me. But what this is showing is in that same period of time, if we use these good genetic tools, as you all do at your place, you can have a lot of positive impacts on a lot of traits all at the same time. So if you look at these lines, for example, we always want calving yeast within, when we can get less dystocia, less calving problems, that's a positive. So you see that red dotted line is going way, way up. At the same time, then it would make sense that the solid red line, which is birth weight, would be going down. Those two things are kind of a bit opposite of one another. At the same time, think about weaning weight. We know that we sell calves in a lot of cases at weaning. In your case, not too long after you wean them, you send them to Columbia, Missouri. And you look at yearling weight, another growth measure that is talked about a lot. And you can see how those two lines run almost right on top of each other as they go up, meaning that over 25 years, you've made really solid growth in both of those growth traits, or improvements in both of those growth traits. Similar for the yellow line of marbling. We know that marbling is a big deal in our industry today. When I was your age, I'll tell you right now that roughly 55% of the cattle graded choice in the industry, and a little less than 1% of the cattle graded prime. Just a few years ago, roughly 70% of the cattle would flirt with going choice, and you might get 2 or 3% prime. Yet today, right here and now, we are getting cattle that across the industry, we are just a little better than 80% choice. And the latest prime number I saw was 9.6, or I'm going to round and call that 10%. And so that marbling number is a really important piece. And then the last one I'll highlight on here is kind of the gray line, and that's stayability, and that's cow longevity, and that's a crucial one. You know that at the end of the day, the thing that makes your family the most money is if a cow stays around for a long time and keeps doing her job. So I bring all that up because this is what good genetics can do for you in your ranch, and that's why we work in this big effort through this side of the business we call IGS. Now, if we believe it to be a data-driven industry, and it is, and so let's talk about some crazy data things you all, to be honest, probably understand and appreciate better than most, certainly than I do, and also a lot of grown-ups. There's this concept of this tool called blockchain. Some of you've probably heard of blockchain, and you probably haven't. But more or less, it's an online way to track things that is difficult to change. So people can watch it over time and know that it stays the same. We have companies like Walmart tracking vegetables. And we have groups in Kansas right now that are identifying ways to track cattle from start to finish. We work with a company called IMI Global on third-party verification of a whole bunch of data points. And again, a large packer called Tyson, that many of you certainly heard of, probably all of you, recently partnered with a large feedlot group called Progressive Beef, again, in an effort to share more data. We live in a data-driven beef industry, and that's a lot different, frankly, than when Dr. Endicott and I were your age. A lot of the stuff we were working with then, while we were trying to use data, we just didn't have the same level of tools. You all are certainly in a much more powerful spot than we would have ever dreamed to be when we were back at your ages. And so with that said, let's talk a little bit about this thing we call the feeder profit calculator and how you can use it to predict some things about your own calves. So we're going to do a couple things with this. It has to highlight the sires of your calves. So almost all of you know who the bull is that sired your calf. And it's also going to highlight management, meaning, did you get those calves weaned 30 days before they came to us or more? Did those calves get vaccinated for that BRD that we talked about earlier? And in this case, you can assume, yes, they have, because many of you did it at home, and yet they're going to get it again at the yard. So that is going to happen. Some of you can identify cow herd stuff, but that won't be so relevant for this conversation. And so you should know it won't be an issue for you because all this stuff is free for you all, but it's always free for anybody who uses it. So if mom and dad are watching over your shoulder and they're going to help you do this, they can know that this comes at no cost to anybody. It's not just because you all are in this program that you get to do it for free. So I'm going to try to keep this simple, but I got to give you a couple terms so that when you see what we're looking at, it doesn't get too confusing. Really, what we're trying to boil this prediction down is, for your calf, we want one number that tells us how your calf compares to the industry. We're going to call that, actually the bottom number here, called the total relative value. And I'll explain that in a bit more in a second. But to get that total relative value on your steer, we got to get two other pieces first. One is the management value. And we're going to see, how does the management of your calf compare to the management of calves in the industry? And so in your case, you have the ability to know that your calves are all weaned for 30 days or more. Your calves are all going to be doubly vaccinated for BRD. And that's a little different because our base assumption is about 60% of the calves in the industry have that, but you all have essentially 100% of that. So you add a lot of value to your calves from a health standpoint because of those things. The middle piece is the genetic value, relative genetic value. And your calf, you put in your calf's genetics through his sire and a little bit about the cow. And then it's going to show how that deviates from the average Angus. And the reason we use the average Angus is it's the most common breed in the beef business right now. And so that gives us something to adjust. We add the management and the genetic together, and that gives that total relative value number that we're going to want on your calves. I'm not going to belabor this picture. It looks very daunting. It's actually pretty simple. Most of these things you've actually already provided to the ASA on your own calf. And so you know these things. And so only things that you're going to really have to think about too much are finding the sire's reg number, which I know already know, and then telling me what the cow is made up of when you put this information in. So this is how it's going to work. You're going to go, again, another screen, another note you might make for yourself if you're sitting there, is the way you're going to do this. This is going to be the second part of your homework, is you're going to go to a website called internationalgeneticsolutions.com. Or you can go to simmental.org, to our website, and you can find it right at the top of the page. And what's going to happen is you're going to go there, and if you see that red circle up in the top right, that's where you're going to go. You're going to click on that link to the feeder profit calculator, and it's going to take you to a very simple form where you're going to put in the information on your calf. Some of you have multiple calves. What I'm going to ask you to do is to do each of your calves individually. Okay? Don't do them as a group. Do them individually. Then, once you put in that information, and just so you know, if you have most of the information you provided when you turned in your calf, and if mom and dad are helping you, if some of this is a little bit new for you, it's probably mom, dad, it's only going to take 15 minutes. This is going to be really fast. It might not even take that long. And in a day or so, you're going to get back a certificate like this on your calf. And up in the blue area, it tells about you, who you are. And so we got that blocked out. But then it's going to tell a whole bunch of stuff up in the middle left on your calf. How much does your calf weigh? Again, remember, you're going to find that on the data sheet that Dr. Endicott talked about. And so you'll know that. And you know the color of your calf. Of course, your calf is a steer, and you'll know those various things. And again, you know the treatment of the calf because you know whatever vaccinations you gave at your place, but you also know the vaccinations that we give in the feed yard now. Then what happens is we put all those things into the system along with the sire's reg number, and you get all these predictions on the right. The stars kind of tell how an animal ranks. But the biggest piece is that bolded black number at the top, the total relative value. And so, for example, what that means is for this calf, if you were the buyer of this calf, you could afford to pay another $8.58 over the average calf that day and still break even. That's a huge bonus in terms of value for a particular animal. And since I've looked at a number of your calves and the genetics of those calves, many of your calves are going to flirt with these kind of numbers because there's a lot of value in this particular group. And I know my colleagues would agree with that. So we're going to see some really nice numbers come by when you see these. Just so you know, we're not going to share your certificate with the group. Now, that total relative value ultimately will make its way onto the calf data sheet. But remember, your names aren't associated with the tag numbers, so nobody else will know who has it. This is for your information only. So you and your family can discuss these things about your calves, predicting the profit of your calves. And so I'm going to show you just a couple of examples real fast, and then we're going to move on past this and let you ask if there's any sort of comments or thoughts. But I want to give you a couple of examples of how this thing works. You all know that certain types of cattle work better together than others, meaning that sometimes when you cross cattle, you get some advantages that you wouldn't have if you kept them as a straight bred or a purebred animal. And so this tool, this feeder profit calculator, can highlight those things that we call breed complementarity and heterosis. And here's an example. I didn't show the bulls just to save space, but of some really profit-focused Simmental bulls on different cow types. So in this first one, we're using some red baldies as cows, a Hereford Red Angus cow base. And those calves have, again, about $6.50 of total relative value. The next one are straight Red Angus, and you can see that's essentially the same number. But now as we start to, in this case, have a cow herd that's half Angus and half Red Angus, you can see that number goes up quite a little bit, mostly because there's a little more terminal merit in today's Angus animal. But to be clear, there are some trade-offs that come with that, going back to some of those concepts about those lines that we talked about earlier in terms of looking at maternal and terminal traits and how they play nice together or sometimes don't. And this is a group where you have, to show you that we can highlight different kinds of breeds. This one is using Sim genetics, in this case actually Sim Angus bulls on top of Gelbvieh Angus or balancer cows. And you can see as we start to get good balance of complementarity and breed heterosis, we can really see those total relative values shoot up. I'm going to highlight just a few things about some different bulls, but I just picked some bulls that are really popular in our system. These might be bulls your family has used. They might be bulls that you don't use, but they're bulls that have been really quite relevant in the Simmental database. And so talking about them. Cowboy Cut has been the most used bull in the last number of years, and so he's a perfect place to start. And you all probably have seen this sort of look when you go to Herd Book on your own calf or some others. This is where Cowboy Cut ranks. And if you just look and you look at his percentiles right here, kind of in that middle, right above that pedigree word, you can see he ranks first or second, or at least in the top 10 and 25% for a whole bunch of traits. So when in this case, this is the backside of this feeder profit calculator. Here we have a situation where we have 600-pound steers, and these steers have not been weaned and they have not been vaccinated. And we've got 3 Cowboy Cut sons on some Angus cows. And you can see that even though you might use some great genetics, if you don't manage them well, in this case, if you don't vaccinate them or you don't provide them a weaning period before you ship them, you build in a lot of problems for those calves, and the buyer is likely to pay you less money because he or she takes on a lot more risk. Here's the same set of bulls and the same calves, but this time you vaccinated them for that whole BRD issue we talked about earlier. This isn't a huge number, but it's a much better number than being negative. Now here is if you're buying good bulls, you got 600-pound steers, and you have weaned them for more than 30 days. They're vaccinated. You're doing your job from a management standpoint. So you bought great genetics, great management. You build in profit potential, and you can see now we're essentially sitting at $10 better than the average calf in the industry. That's a big win, and it shows how genetics alone can't do it by itself. You have to invest in doing some of the heavy lifting of management to really kick the profit potential of where it needs to be. Here's another popular bull, United. Many of you have seen United calves. You've seen United in all parts of our industry, in the feedlots and the show rings and bull sales. He's been heavily represented for a number of years now. And if you put him on some straight Angus cows, you can see a really nice total relative value for that bull. And you can see there from his genetic pieces how he ranks at a pretty high level for a whole host of terminal traits as well. Here's another popular bull, a bit more modern bull called Boulder. And Boulder on some Angus cows, interestingly enough, gets at the exact same number. Strikes me pretty funny when I saw this, but here's the thing. Watch how this works. I'm going to back up a screen so you can see United again. If you look at United really closely, if you look at some of the details, what it is showing that these cattle will gain quicker and they'll stay a little trimmer. So they'll have heavier carcasses and they'll get there a little faster. But the bolder calves are going to grade a little better, meaning they have a higher percent choice, and so they get a little more value that way. So there's some trade-offs on these two, but interestingly enough, they come to the exact same number. To be really honest, that's pretty rare. That doesn't happen very frequently at all. And so, again, this guy probably has a bit more of what some would call a balanced genetic profile. He's got a lot of terminal traits, but he also has a lot of maternal traits built in as well. Just highlighting some common and popular bulls. Now, here I'm actually highlighting some common and popular bulls as well. But I want you to know I've blocked out the bulls, and I'll tell you why. These are bulls that are a little more focused on show ring appeal, and that's perfectly fine. No concerns with those things. However, recognize sometimes if we look at things just from a look standpoint, we can forget some of the genetic components. And so so I've hid the three bulls I've used, but trust me, if many of you would know the sires if I moved that little gray box, which I'm not going to do. And you put those on some Sim Angus cows, and you can see that while these, if you look here to the middle on the left inside the blue box, the GV or the genetic value is only 55 cents per hundredweight, meaning that while these cattle were managed well, so the total relative value gets to about $5, there's not a lot of added genetic merit out of this bull battery. But then the big issue is you look on the right and you try to balance that terminal with maternal, and you can see these calves struggle with calving ease, they struggle with stayability or daughter longevity, and they struggle with that API all-purpose index. And so there's a lot of things to balance when you're making mating decisions, and they're not always just terminal or just maternal or just look or just price. There's a whole bunch of things that go into the equation, and this is just an opportunity to highlight. So the IGS Feeder Profit Calculator gives you this third-party tool that doesn't cost anybody, and you get for 15, 20 minutes of your time, you get this certificate. And what do they do with that certificate? In your case, it's going to be an educational tool. But for folks who are selling cattle or for folks who are buying cattle, they'll use that certificate to make big decisions on large groups of cattle that amount to many, many tens of thousands of dollars. And just to show you that what we talk about price, some of you might have heard the term price differentiation. That means how we distinguish the value of one animal versus the worth and the value of another. Price differentiation can be pretty real in different platforms. And this is, I just chose one that some of you may have heard of, Superior Livestock Auction. It's the largest marketer of feeder calves in the United States. And you can see what those numbers are below for the heifers and steers show that if folks have added steps, added knowledge about their animals, you can clearly get greater return on your investment. So this visual is just to show you that concept of price differentiation for maybe some of the older folks on the call who have heard of that effort is real if you move cattle of large enough groups and in the right environments. So with that said, I don't want to belabor this too much, so I want to tell you what your task is to do. You're going to do first, I already mentioned to you that you're going to identify for us the initial value of your feeder calf. And the way you're going to do that is you're going to have to reference back to this talk when it gets posted tomorrow. And then you're going to look at the weight of your calf, and you're simply going to multiply those together, and you're going to report that to Dr. Endicott by email. At the same time, then you're going to go and submit your calf information into the feeder profit calculator. Remember, that is internationalgeneticsolutions.com, or you can go to simmental.org and find it at the top of the page. That's going to take you about 15 to 20 minutes. That actually will land in my email inbox, whether you want it to or not. And so I'll know if you got that done, and I'll report that to Dr. Endicott so that she knows. And so we ask you to do both of those things by next Monday. Don't think either one of them are going to take you much time. Mom and Dad, if you're listening over their shoulder, this is a half an hour effort, maybe. This isn't a heavy lift for them, but we want them to take these steps. One, so they understand how much value their calf would be if they had to go buy that same calf today in the industry. And then the other piece is we need them to become wiser and more tuned in than maybe certainly than I was when I was their age. And we want them to start looking at some of these tools like the feeder profit calculator, and we'll certainly introduce them to other tools as we go through this project. And again, if you could have those reported by next Monday, that would be awesome. And so with that, a lot to digest all at once. And so I'm going to be quiet for a minute and see if anybody has any questions or comments, or maybe I even confused Dr. Endicott along the way. Maybe we can help straighten her out if we need to.
All right, you guys, so if you would like, you can go ahead and put your questions in, chat your questions in, and we'll do our best to answer them. One thing I do want to remind you, so I was kind of working on two things at once today. So the calf data sheet that Chip is commenting about, that's on the SPC page. So where you go to register for the webinar, that same colored block of items right across from where it says webinar registration here, it's going to say calf data. And if you click on that calf data link, that's going to be a spreadsheet. That's going to be a living document. So it's going to grow all year. So each time that we have a weigh day, we'll put new weights in there. And so we'll go through and add data to that throughout the entire time. Again, as Chip reminded you, they're just listed by tag number, so no names are associated. So everybody gets to see how they're doing, but only you know which steers are yours. And so,
might I add in there just
please?
You'll get, just so you know, you'll have roughly 10 different metrics that you'll receive each month on your calf. You'll get a lot of data. There's going to be a lot of value, and that'll be posted here within just some number of days. Like I mentioned, probably by the time you complete these two steps, Rachel and I will have our steps completed and get that information up. And that information will talk about not only how your calf gain, how much feed they consume, but it'll also show you what your costs are for that calf in terms of what's the health cost this month, what's the feed cost for my calf this month. So you'll have a running tally of the cost associated with your calf as we go forward in the project.
Okay, Chip, we do have a question. Campbell family wants to know, how many days is it between each weigh day?
Great question. And that will vary slightly, but typically it's going to be roughly a month. And so there will be things that will make that move just a little bit. So you could see this time it wasn't quite a month, few days short of that. And of course our calculations adjust to the actual day. That's what's important for us there. So we don't round to the month. We're going to do it actually to the day. But roughly every month your calves will get weighed. We have to be sensitive to the feed yard and their personnel, and it does take a little time to do each of these individually. You might say, well, it doesn't take very long at all to run this many calves across the chute. No, it doesn't. But because recall, your calves are in pens of 3 or 4, and so they're in small groups. And to keep those straight, they have to be cautious not to mix those. And plus, they're also very cautious to move your cattle slowly. They don't want to move them with any sort of speed whatsoever. They don't want to risk any problems. They don't want to get them wound up. So it'll take a decent period of time for them to get them all weighed appropriately. And so anyway, with all that rambling said, roughly every 30 days, you'll get a weight. And every 30 days, you will get, and subsequently to that, you will get a report on your expenses, how your calf's doing. So every time you get a weight, that'll generate the next bill.
Excellent. Next question, is vaccinating them twice a waste of money, or does it increase their resistance in any way? From Rain Health.
Hey, phenomenal question. Phenomenal question. Actually, vaccinating them twice is a crucial step because it's very possible that ideally what you're going to do is vaccinate these calves some period of time prior to weaning, and then oftentimes directly around or after weaning time. And what that does is, I'm going to save a little bit of this information because that's such a phenomenal question, Ray. We're going to have, I hope we've done it the past couple of years, had somebody on talking about vaccinations and protocols, and I'll let them walk through some of the details in a later call on a later webinar on why that's important. But that is a phenomenal question, and absolutely it's important. And to prove that to you, if you were to go back and look at some of that superior data that I mentioned before, again, they market roughly 500,000 feeder calves a year. And the reason that vaccination is so important is effectively it works like risk management for the buyer. Some of you probably come from families that do a little crop farming, and when you're crop farming, you have various risk management tools. Sometimes that's using the board, the concept of futures and hedging. Sometimes it's in the form of crop insurance. But you're using various risk management tools to minimize your loss or to help guarantee some level of return. Well, in our business, you don't really have those kind of tools. And so our genetic prowess and knowing the value of a calf and the health and the management of those calves, those to the buyer really are their only really risk management tool. And so to prove how important it is to the buyer, when you look at those superior numbers, frequently calves that have 2 rounds of shots in them and have been weaned for 30 days are worth $5 to $6 more a hundred, or on a 6-weight calf, that's somewhere in the ballpark of $30 to $40 more per calf, just because they have those things. And the reason that's important specifically is that the data shows that calves that have not had that second round are up to as much as 15% more likely to get sick or die than their counterparts who haven't. So it's a great question. I don't want to go into some of the biological details. We'll save those for our health call later on. But that's a phenomenal question. Hopefully I at least planted enough of a seed on that one so you can revisit that again.
Okay. Audrey wants to know, when running the IGS feeder profit calculator, do you need any information on the cow or just her breed composition?
Audrey, that's an awesome question. You can do it 2 ways. Some of you may not have a lot of information on your cow. And to be clear, you all probably know a lot more about your cows than a lot of commercial producers in the industry. So you are going to be a lot more knowledgeable than many. So if you don't know the sire of the cow, or if she doesn't have a reg number or any of those kind of things, you're going to just guesstimate the breed composition. So if you tell me that I don't know who she is, but she's a Sim Angus female, okay, I can do a fair amount with that. But you might know specifically the reg number of that female. You might be able to tell me that, oh, I know who her sire is, or what we would call the maternal grandsire of your steer. You might be able to tell me you know her. In that case, what you could do is something a little different than what most commercial producers can do. If Audrey, you'd go ahead and put in the reg number where it says, can you tell me about the cow or the maternal grandsires? Just put in the reg number of your female, and we'll be able to use that very effectively. That's a great question.
What type of grasses are in the hay that the calves are getting, and how much are they eating each day?
Hay at this point is fairly minor. If you don't mind, I'm gonna go back to that screen and see if I can get that back up for you. When you all are, while we're talking about this. Oop. There we go. But the hay that's used predominantly at this feed yard is brome hay. That is the most prevalent part. You also saw that there's a little bit of wheatlage component, so there's a little bit of wheat in some of this. Sorry, I could have dropped out and probably done it easier, but we're backing up, so that's fine. So here's the diet. So most of the hay that they're going to see is going to continue to be brome hay for the bulk of the time. And just so you know, I think I mentioned it before. That's where most of the expense, added expense, or the change in the cost of rations came from last year. For those of you who were with us last year, these are essentially the same rations that you used last year. So the only difference in cost, actually, to be honest, the only significant difference at all was the hay. And so mostly all brome at this point. There was a little wheat baleage at the very beginning. So that's a great question.
Okay, we'll wait a few minutes here and see if anybody has any other questions. But like Chip said, you guys can go ahead and calculate your initial values. And when you email those, you can just email those to the SPC at simgene.com email address. I'm monitoring that, so feel free to use that one. Hope that you got your newsletter and those important dates on those newsletters. You'll see those as we move along. So you'll be getting your first bill here in the next 10 days, 2 weeks or so, and so we'll get going on that exciting piece. And just one reminder in thinking about the January webinar, if we stuck to our guns, the first Tuesday is New Year's Day. I plan on having that be a vacation day, and I suspect that you guys do too. So we will do the January webinar on Tuesday, January 8th of 2019. And I'll remind you of that as we go along, but just keep that in mind. We won't meet on the first Tuesday. We'll meet on the second Tuesday in that particular month. Chip, it doesn't look like we have any more questions at this time. So what else?
Well, I'll throw one more thing at you, and then I'll be quiet and leave you good people alone. Should you have any questions at all when you're doing the feeder profit calculator or valuation, and it's obviously Dr. Endicott can handle those, but if it's something that you need to throw at me, feel free to let me know. You can email me at ckemp@simgene.com. If you have feeder profit calculator questions or what have you, just let me know. I'll be glad to help. Okay? Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we'll go ahead and sign off, everybody. Thanks so much. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and we'll look forward to hearing from you with this month's assignment. So have a great evening.
Oh, by the way,
yes.
Merry Christmas to all of you if you don't chat with you again between now and then.